Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. Before I start my talk, let me begin by thanking Elena for providing Arabic translation today. The data that I'll draw on in my presentation come from my doctoral fieldwork in and around Mafraq in northern Jordan in 2016 and 17. And this was only made possible by a local Jordanian family from the Al-Amush subtribe who hosted me for a year. And they're watching right now from their living room in Mafraq, and I'm sharing this with you to emphasize that these acts of translation are not only necessary, but they're also deeply meaningful to the people we work and live with. So there are two things that I would like to achieve in my talk today. I would first like to develop an alternative understanding of how Syrian refugees in northern Jordan make homes, and about the role that mobility and mobility-based coping strategies play in the survival of poor Syrians. And the second thing I would like to do is to put a place, Zaatari, back on the map, not as a humanitarian facility in the desert, but as a place where people have long nurtured different types of belonging. And this is what my talk is about, essentially. It's about different types of welcome that the Jordanians in northern Jordan have extended to Syrian refugees. Now, let me start with an image that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, a satellite view of Zaatari Camp, which at its peak hosted something like 130,000 Syrian refugees, is now home to something like 80,000 people, which makes it the Middle East's biggest refugee camp and also Jordan's 5th biggest city. And I'm sure you might agree that this representation of the camp has become iconic of Syrian displacement in Jordan and the wider Middle East. Now, the problem with this bird's eye view is that it obscures as much as it reveals. For example, that most of Syrian refugees in Jordan do not live in camps like these. Actually, more than 80% of Syrian refugees in Jordan live in bigger cities like Amman, mid-sized town like nearby Mafraq, and even in villages like the villages I'm going to talk about today. What the image also doesn't tell you is that this is not simply a site of containment that has put a halt to Syrians' flight from their home country. It is actually embedded in a landscape that has long been shaped by different types of mobility. And finally, what you don't see on the picture is that before there was a camp called Zaatari, there was a village of the same name, and that the village and its people are still there, just on the other side of the fence, and that they're also hosting Syrian refugees. And that's what my talk is about today. It's about Syrians in Zaatari Village, a place which is home to something like 12,000 Jordanians and more recently to between 4,000 and 5,000 Syrian refugees. Now, what is so special about Zaatari Village? Well, first, although Zaatari Village is literally a stone's throw away from the Middle East, one of the Middle East's biggest humanitarian hubs, the refugees in the village mostly live under the radar of humanitarian agencies. They're all registered with the UNHCR, but they do not receive further assistance from NGOs, and instead they get by through working in the informal economy, mostly in agriculture, but also by working on construction sites. But what is truly unique about Zaatari Village is that Syrian refugees in this specific town have been given land by the Jordanian host community. Have been given land by the Jordanian host community and have started building houses, brick shacks like this one. And just to put this into perspective, outside refugee camps in Jordan, only 1% of Syrian refugees own the dwellings they live in. Now, who are these Syrians? The Syrian refugees whom I interviewed in November 2016 all seem to come from the same neighborhood in Homs city, a neighborhood called Al-Bayadeh, which you can see there with the arrow, which used to be a low-income Sunni neighborhood in the north of Homs, which after 2011 came to the attention of international media because it was one of the strongholds of Syrian opposition and frequently shelled and eventually destroyed by the Syrian regime and deserted by most of its inhabitants. And the end of this neighborhood, late 2013, also coincides with the arrival of Syrian refugees to Zaatari Village. Now, one thing that deserves pointing out is that Jordan, like most host countries in the Middle East, is not a signatory to the Geneva Convention on Refugees, which means that Syrian refugees' protection in the country is limited, their freedom of movement is curtailed, is curtailed, and they need to obtain work permits like any other migrant workers to access the formal labor market. In the official language of the Jordanian state, Syrian refugees have been received as temporary guests with no access to citizenship for themselves or their offspring. But interestingly, in Zaatari Village, Syrian refugees have been received as guests, not only within Jordan's restrictive refugee reception scheme, but also in a more traditional sense as tribesmen. Because it turns out that Syrian refugees from Al-Bayada neighborhood and Jordanians in Zaatari Village have one thing in common: they're all members of the Beni Khaled tribe, a cross-border tribe. Now, what does it mean in practice to share tribal connections? It means that long before 2011, there was a long backstory of cross-border family visits and marriages. More recently, since 2011, this shared tribal belonging has translated into concrete material support, help with securing legal status in the host country, and access to jobs. So just to give you an example, the Syrian refugees whom we find in Zaatari Village, right next to the camp, have never actually entered this camp, because when they arrived to Jordan, their Jordanian kin were waiting at the gates of the camp with the paperwork ready to bail them out and then take them to the village. More recently, in Zaatari Village, where they have settled in these brick houses and sometimes also in tents, they've been able to tap into the electricity grid and the water supply of their Jordanian neighbors. And this Jordanian-Syrian solidarity is important because in turn, it also enables new form of assistance within the refugee community. For example, some young Syrian men from the community have teamed up to build houses on land provided by Jordanian relatives for widows and single and female-headed households. Now, these Syrian refugees have thus received multiple forms and very valuable support from their Jordanian kin, but they also give something back in return, which is cheap labor. And this is where the story becomes more complicated. Actually, I've talked to Syrian refugees in Zaatari Village, some of whom had started working in the village intermittently since as early as the 1980s, first in agriculture, more recently also in construction. And this is only symptomatic of wider economic transformation in the Middle East and the migrantization of low-skilled labor in countries like Jordan and also Lebanon. Now, I would like you to have a look at the two houses that you see here. Take the houses in the picture below, take these brick houses. One of these houses was built by Mahmoud, a young Syrian man from Homs, who has invested all of the savings that he's been able to make since he arrived to Zaatari Village to build one of these houses. It cost him something like 10,000 Jordanian dinars. Now, he was able to do that because he also took part in building another house, the house of his Jordanian cousin, which you see up there, a much more sumptuous villa, where Mahmoud was paid something like 10 Jordanian dinar a day on the construction site. And I'm contrasting these two houses not only to highlight that Syrian and Jordanians might have different ideas about what an ideal home might look like, but also to illustrate these class dynamics that complicate the hosting relationship. And nowhere does that become more clear than when we look at the gift of land. Now, Mahmoud was able to build a house partly because he was given a patch of land by his Jordanian cousin, and yet he has no intention to stay longer than absolutely necessary. He is adamant that he will return to Syria the moment it becomes safe to do so. Now, why would Mahmoud build a house? Now, it appears that the young Syrian men who've built houses in Zaatari Village have done so because they think that building material houses goes hand in hand with establishing a more social form of homes, which is having a family of their own. In other words, they build houses as a precondition to getting married. But in turn, these future and imagined families have become incorporated into dreams of return to Syria. For Jordanian hosts as well, the eventual return of their Syrian kin has become part of future dreams of mobility. Not mobility in space, but dreams of upward social mobility, because this land, which used to be a patch of empty land in the desert, has suddenly greatly increased in value because it finds itself now right next to a refugee camp, which is about to turn into a sprawling urban center. So dreams of mobility and return on both sides while houses are being built. Now, what I've established so far is that Syrian displacement to Zaatari Village has taken place in a context which is shaped by pre-war marital and labor migrations. Joining the dots of these migrations is interesting because it tells us where Syrians go in the Middle East, where they seek refuge and jobs, and it also makes us understand how poor Syrians survive in exile through their ability to tap into these long-standing transnational networks. Now, has nothing changed? Of course it has. What is new is that these former labor migrants who have returned to Zaatari Village as refugees have come to depend much more heavily on their Jordanian relatives, not only for employment, but also for securing legal status in the host country. What is also new is the gender demographics of the Syrian presence in Zaatari Village, whereas it used to be mostly young Syrian men coming to Zaatari Village on an intermittent basis. They have now returned and brought their wives and children, and in many cases left them in Zaatari Village before they returned again to Syria, which explains the high rate of female-headed households in the area. Now, in the final minutes, let me discuss these findings and come back to my initial theme of homemaking and the role of mobilities. This is a painting by the Scottish artist Derek Robertson, who has taken an interest in parallels between birds and human migrations in the Jordanian desert. And what you see in the painting is a tiny bird, a bee-eater, which is a migratory bird, that gets stranded in the desert and seeks refuge on top of a car. And it is saved by a group of children who feed it on a little saucer. Now, I'm particularly interested in Derek Robertson's work because to me it highlights the parallels between migratory birds and these human people that I have introduced you to today. Their ability to lead mobile lives and engage in acts of navigation and use fixed points which might not be obvious to the eye of an outside observer. What humans and birds also have in common is their sensitivity to changing habitats. When birds' flight patterns get rerouted, this is often an indicator of environmental change, and in a similar way, human flows are often rerouted by man-made and natural disasters. And with this comes the risk of getting stuck, as has happened to these former migrants turned refugees in Zaatari Village the moment the Syrian-Jordanian border closed for good, at least between 2016 and 2018. And what this painting brings home, I feel very nicely, is that in these situations, when people get lost, they survive through making temporary homes in seemingly inhospitable environments, and they can only do so through acts of solidarity. And I think I've tried to make clear in my talk that I don't romanticize acts of solidarity between Syrians and Jordanians in Zaatari Village. Of course, these are always mediated by class differences and differential access to land ownership and citizenship. And even projects of homemaking in the present might be informed by future mobility projects. But the reason I'm interested in the role of mobility and homes is because I find that these findings can inspire a critique of the humanitarian system that curtails Syrian refugees' freedom of movement and the very transnational livelihoods that might otherwise sustain them. So in a policy environment in the global south and the global north, which is increasingly hostile to migrants and refugees alike, I advocate for putting refugees' mobility and mobility-based coping strategies back on the agenda. That means asking, if we were to enable Syrian refugees not as one-time returnees, but as frequent border crossers, would it be conceivable that renewed circular migration might restore lost livelihoods? And if we accept that, what could host states and the international community do to make circular mobilities safer and more dignified?